The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon candles should have felt like home. I pulled into the driveway of my daughter Sarah's house, the same house I'd helped buy, the same mortgage I'd co-signed when she couldn't qualify a loan. The Christmas lights twinkled against the December snow, and I could hear laughter spilling through the windows. My heart warmed as I grabbed the carefully wrapped presents from my back seat. I'd been looking forward to this dinner for weeks. After my wife passed 2 years ago, these family gatherings had become my lifeline. I knocked gently and pushed open the front door, expecting the usual chorus of, "Grandpa's here." Instead, I was met with an uncomfortable silence. "Dad," Sarah said, barely looking up from carving the turkey. Her tone was flat, distant. The grandchildren glanced at me briefly before returning to their phones. Even my son-in-law Mark avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by his wine glass. I set the presents under the tree and took my usual seat at the head of the table, the chair I'd sat in for 15 Christmases. But tonight felt different. The conversations were muted, the smiles forced. When I tried to engage my grandson about his college plans, Sarah cut me off. "Dad, we need to talk." She set down the carving knife and finally looked at me directly. Her eyes were cold, calculated. "Honestly, we don't need you anymore." The words hit like a physical blow. The warm Christmas air suddenly felt suffocating. Time seemed to freeze. The grandfather clock in the corner, the one I'd bought them as a housewarming gift, ticked loudly in the silence. I stared at my daughter, searching her face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But her expression remained stone cold. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackling fireplace. She shrugged as if discussing the weather. "We're financially stable now. Mark got his promotion. The kids are grown. We don't need you coming around anymore." I felt my chest tighten. This was the same little girl I'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms. The same daughter I'd worked double shifts for, missing countless dinners myself so she could have piano lessons, dance classes, the best education money could buy. I'd sacrificed my own retirement, my own dreams, pouring everything into her future. The memories flooded back, teaching her to ride a bike in this very driveway, walking her down the aisle at her wedding, holding her firstborn in this living room. I'd built my entire world around this family, around being needed, being wanted, being loved. But now, sitting at their dinner table surrounded by the family I'd given everything for, I realized I'd become nothing more than an obligation, a burden they were finally brave enough to shed. My hands trembled as I reached for my water glass, trying to process the cruelty of her words. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. I looked around the table hoping someone, anyone, would speak up, would tell Sarah she'd gone too far. My grandson Tommy stared at his plate, his face red with embarrassment. My granddaughter Emma had tears in her eyes but said nothing. Mark cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sarah, maybe—" "No, Mark." She raised her hand to silence him. "He needs to hear this. We've all been talking, and we think it's time Dad understood his place in this family. His place. I'd built this family. I'd been the foundation they'd all stood on." The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, each note echoing my growing heartbreak. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I love you. I love all of you. If I've done something wrong, it's not about wrong or right, Dad. It's about independence. We're adults now. We make our own decisions, our own money. We don't need you hovering around, trying to fix everything, offering advice nobody asked for." The irony cut deep. For 35 years, they'd needed me for everything. Bail money when Mark lost his first job, down payments, college tuitions, medical bills. I'd been their ATM, their safety net, their solution to every problem. But now that they were comfortable because of my sacrifices, I was suddenly disposable. I watched Tommy fidget with his napkin. Emma wiped her eyes quietly. Even they seemed shocked by their mother's coldness, but neither had the courage to defend me. Sitting there in that chair, I drifted back to the beginning. I was 22 when Sarah was born, barely making ends meet as a junior accountant. But I had dreams, big dreams for my little girl. I wanted her to have everything I never had: stability, opportunity, choices. I remembered the night shift at the warehouse I took on weekends, loading trucks until my back screamed just to pay for her braces. I remembered selling my father's vintage car, the only thing of value he'd left me, to cover her college application fees. I remembered the look of joy on her face when she got accepted to her dream school. and how I'd smiled even though I knew it meant I'd be eating ramen for the next 4 years. When she married Mark, I'd given them the down payment for this house. $25,000, my entire emergency fund, the money I'd saved for my own retirement. But seeing her happiness, seeing her settled and secure, had felt worth every penny. I'd missed vacations, postponed medical appointments, lived in the same small apartment for 15 years while pouring every extra dollar into their lives. When my wife got sick, I juggled her care with still supporting their family, never once asking them to choose between us. And when she died, when I was drowning in grief and loneliness, they'd been my anchor. Or so I'd thought. Now I realized I'd been mistaking tolerance for love, obligation for affection. The man who'd sacrificed everything was being told he was nothing. I looked directly at Sarah, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Is this really how you feel? All of you? She didn't hesitate. Yes, Dad. We don't need you. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just consumed everything I held dear. I glanced at Mark, who was studying his hands, at Tommy, who looked like he wanted to disappear, at Emma, who was crying silently into her napkin. And what about you, Mark? I asked quietly. Do you feel the same way? He shifted uncomfortably. This was the same man who'd called me crying 5 years ago when he lost his job, begging for help with the mortgage. The same man who'd asked me to co-sign his car loan because his credit was shot. Well, Sarah and I discussed this, and we think, Sarah interrupted, that you need to respect our boundaries. We're grateful for everything you've done, but that doesn't give you the right to insert yourself into our lives forever. Grateful, as if my love, my sacrifices, my entire adult life had been some kind of favor I was now cashing in. As if wanting to spend Christmas with my family was an intrusion rather than the most natural thing in the world. Something inside me shifted. The hurt began crystallizing into something harder, clearer. If they didn't need me, then perhaps it was time they learned what that really meant. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor I'd helped install 3 summers ago. The sound seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Everyone's eyes were on me, waiting to see if I'd argue, if I'd beg, if I'd make a scene instead. I walked to the coat closet and pulled out my jacket, the wool coat Sarah had given me last Christmas with a card that read, "To the best dad in the world." The irony wasn't lost on me. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, but there was no concern in her voice, just annoyance. "I'm respecting your boundaries," I said calmly, zipping up my coat. "If you don't need me, then I won't impose myself on you anymore." I walked to the Christmas tree and picked up the gifts I'd brought, carefully chosen presents I'd spent weeks selecting. "I'll return these. No point in wasting money on people who don't need me." For the first time that evening, I saw uncertainty flicker across Sarah's face. Maybe she'd expected me to grovel, to promise to change, to beg for their love. She certainly hadn't expected calm acceptance. "Dad, you don't have to be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic, Sarah. I'm listening to you. You've made your position very clear." I walked to the front door, pausing only to look back at the family I'd built, the people I'd loved more than my own life. They sat frozen around the table, suddenly unsure if they'd gotten what they wanted or lost something they couldn't replace. The cold December air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it felt refreshing after the suffocating atmosphere inside. The drive home felt surreal. Christmas lights blurred past my windows, and I could see other families gathered around dinner tables, sharing laughter and love. I'd always assumed I'd have that forever, that family was unbreakable, that love was permanent. My small apartment felt even smaller when I walked in. The silence was deafening. No grandchildren's laughter, no Sarah's voice calling from the kitchen, no warmth of belonging. Just me and the echoes of "we don't need you" bouncing off the walls. I sat in my recliner, the one piece of furniture I'd kept when, I'd sold everything else to help them over the years, and stared at the few family photos I had left. Sarah's graduation, her wedding, the grandchildren's school pictures. In every photo, I was smiling, proud, believing I was part of something beautiful and lasting. But tonight had shattered that illusion. I wasn't part of their family. I was their ATM. And now that they were financially stable, the ATM was no longer needed. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw, but underneath it, something else was growing, clarity. If they truly didn't need me, then they certainly didn't need my money. And I had a lot more control over their lives than they realized. The irony was delicious. The same independence they claimed to want was completely dependent on the inheritance they assumed was coming their way. Monday morning, I called my attorney, Richard Morrison. We'd known each other for 20 years, ever since I'd started building real wealth and needed someone to help me protect it. Tom, good to hear from you. How was Christmas? Educational, I said. Richard, I need to see you today. I want to change my will. There was a pause. Change it how? Completely. Richard's office smelled like leather and old books, familiar and comforting. He pulled out my current will, a document that left everything to Sarah, with provisions for the grandchildren. My entire life's work, nearly $2 million in assets, properties, and investments, all earmarked for the daughter who'd just told me she didn't need me. Tom, are you sure about this? Will changes made in emotional states can sometimes— I've never been more certain of anything in my life, I interrupted. Richard, let me ask you something. If someone tells you they don't need you, should you force yourself on them? He frowned. Well, no, but then they don't need my money either. I spent 3 hours that afternoon rewriting my legacy. The house Sarah thought she'd inherit, going to a children's hospital, the savings account she'd mentally spent a dozen times, divided between charities that actually appreciated help, the investment portfolio that was supposed to secure her future, creating scholarships for kids who appreciated education. Richard kept asking if I was sure, if I wanted to think about it longer. But every time I hesitated, I heard Sarah's voice. We don't need you. Fine. They'd get exactly what they wanted. Complete independence. 6 months later, I had a heart attack. Nothing dramatic, nothing drawn out, just a quiet end to a life that had run its course. I'd lived to see my grandchildren graduate, to know they'd turned out well despite their parents, and to ensure my final wishes were ironclad. Sarah found me in my apartment 2 days later when I missed our monthly coffee date, the one tradition she'd maintained, probably out of guilt rather than love. She'd been calling, worried, she told the paramedics. But it was too late for worry. The funeral was small. Sarah cried appropriately, played the grieving daughter for the neighbors and friends. Mark spoke about what a generous man I'd been, how I'd always been there for the family. The grandchildren seemed genuinely sad, and I felt some comfort knowing they'd actually loved me, even if they'd been too young to speak up that Christmas night. But the real moment of truth came a week later, when Richard read my will. Sarah had assumed it was a formality, just signing papers to transfer my wealth to her name. She'd probably already been planning what to do with the inheritance. Maybe thinking about a bigger house, nicer cars, luxury vacations. Instead, she discovered that the father who wasn't needed had taken her at her word. The children's hospital would be getting a new wing. 15 deserving students would receive full college scholarships. 3 homeless shelters would receive endowments to operate for the next decade. Sarah? She received a $1 and a note. To my daughter, who told me she didn't need me. I hope your independence serves you well. The silence in Richard's office was deafening. Sarah stared at the will documents, reading them over and over as if the words might change. Mark's face had gone ashen. Even the grandchildren looked confused, trying to understand how their inheritance had vanished. This can't be legal, Sarah finally whispered. He was my father. That money should be mine. Richard adjusted his glasses. The will is perfectly legal, Sarah. Your father was of sound mind and his instructions were very clear. He met with me multiple times over the past 6 months to ensure everything was exactly as he wanted. But why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why would he do this to us? The answer was right there in her own words from that Christmas dinner. She'd told him she didn't need him, that they were independent, that his presence was unwanted. He'd simply given her exactly what she'd asked for. I like to think that in that moment, Sarah finally understood the weight of what she'd said, that she realized the man who'd spent his entire adult life ensuring her security had been listening when she'd told him his love wasn't wanted. The money went to people who needed it, who appreciated it, who would honor the values I'd tried to instill in my family. The Children's Hospital named a ward after me. The scholarship recipients sent thank you letters saying how my generosity had changed their lives. My legacy lived on, just not in the hands of people who'd taken it for granted. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give ungrateful children is the chance to learn what independence really costs. Sarah got everything she'd asked for that Christmas night, a life without her father's interference, support or love, and she got it exactly as she'd requested, permanently. In the end, the daughter who said we don't need you discovered just how much they actually did. But by then, it was too late for apologies, too late for regrets, and too late for the inheritance she'd assumed was her birthright. The greatest revenge isn't always dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's simply giving people exactly what they claim they want.